Hi friends, welcome. I'm Jane from Sustain My Craft Habit. I am just outside of Toronto, Ontario. I blog there with my sister Sonia about DIY crafts and home decor ideas. I'm going to be talking today about some tips and tricks that I've learned over the past 3 years of working with resin to help minimize the bubbles in your resin projects. This particular project is made with all sorts of different fall leaves, and I really love it. I collected them in the fall, and this actually I created about 2 years ago, and it still is one of my favorite pieces. I keep it at work and I look at it every day. But I had trouble when I first started, and the problem was I did this. It looks really foggy, murky, and there's a ton of micro bubbles. The problem was that my resin was too cold, and that's what happens. The resin doesn't mix together properly or doesn't react properly, and you get all these tiny little bubbles. So now what I do with all of my resin projects, before I start, I fill a little plastic bowl just about like halfway with warm water, not hot water, because you want it not to be, it can't be hot, but just nice and warm. And then I'll put my bottles inside just like this, just as I'm getting ready with all my other stuff to work on my project, and I let it sit there for a few minutes. And this really helps to warm them up. You want the bottles to be warm to the touch, and I find that just this simple act before any particular project helps to reduce the bubbles, even the bigger bubbles, by at least half, if not 60%. So this is probably my top tip for reducing those bubbles, and I do it now. Even if it's a warm summer day, I will do this, because depending on where the resin is coming from, where I've been keeping it, it may be a bit cooler. So that is important part. I do want to stress that you really should read all the instructions for each of the products before you use them, because some of them have optimal temperatures at which they work, and so you want to definitely read that. And I still do. I've been doing this for 3 years, and I still like to go back before I start the different projects to make sure that I'm catching everything. The other important piece before you start a project, this has happened to me with some of my wood surfaces. If I fail to seal the surface, especially if it's a more porous surface, then bubbles obviously will kind of come through the piece. So you can see this was just a wood box I picked up at Michael's, and what happens, I failed to actually seal it. I did paint it, so that helped a bit, but you want to use like a water-based sealer to paint that surface first to really seal it, because I found afterwards some kind of like divots formed where the bubbles later popped as the resin cured. So that's not ideal, and that's a little bit of a learning, and I'm still constantly learning. I mean, that's one of the beauty about working with resin. The possibilities are endless, and there's so many different ways you can use it and create different things. We've done jewelry, keychains, decor, home decor, so you can find this tutorial on our blog. Really all sorts of projects. I've talked about 2 of those 6 tips for reducing resin bubbles in your resin crafting projects. The next tip is when you actually pour your resin into the little cups. So for instance, with this jewelry resin package, comes in there 2 little mixing cups, because what you do is you pour your resin and the hardener, the 2 parts, into 1 cup, and then you stir it slowly for 2 minutes. And this is one of the places to reduce the amount of bubbles in your pieces. You want to stir slowly, gently scrape the sides of the container and the bottom. I also like to kind of hold the cup in my hand, so the warmth from my hand kind of maintains the same temperature. I don't know that that helps, but that's what I like to do. You always wear gloves as well when you're working with the resin. But again, that tip is to slowly mix. The faster you mix, the more you agitate it, the more air gets incorporated into the resin mixture, and we want to try to minimize that. And then the same, once you mix that for 2 minutes, you will actually transfer that mixture into your second cup. And again, if you can pour it slowly, kind of against the side of the container, so that you're not introducing more air than you need to in the cup. Once it's in there, then you take a second stir stick and you stir that for a minute, and then you go to pour the piece into your mold. So this is now where the 4th tip comes in, I think we've covered putting the seal coat, warming the bottles, mixing the resin carefully and slowly. And then the next part comes when you're actually pouring the mixture into your mold. So it doesn't matter if you have a small jewelry resin mold or if you are doing a bigger piece like this. You want to pour the resin. So let's pretend that this is my mold. We're going to gently and slowly pour the resin against the side so that it kind of coats the surface and pushes any air up from underneath. So that's a little bit of a skill to practice over time. And again, like I've been doing this 3 years. I have not mastered a lot of these things. Sometimes you just get excited and you want to finish it. But what really always shocks me with these projects is even though I don't necessarily get to follow all these steps, they always turn out better than I imagined. I won't say always, but I'll say like 90% of the time. So, you know, this, once I troubleshooted those micro bubbles, now the pieces come out so pretty and I just am really so happy with it. This is another piece I created a couple of years ago, and we used it to make toppers for little mason jars as a gift idea. The fifth tip is, so now that you've poured your resin into the mold, you want to let it sit for about 5-10 minutes, and what you'll see is that any air that did get incorporated into the resin starts to rise to the surface and creates little bubbles on the surface. And sometimes you can't even see those bubbles, but the best way to get rid of them is to use, this is what I've started to use and I love, it's just a simple kitchen torch. There you can find them for $15-20 really anywhere. I think they're meant for like creme brulee and things like that. And you just turn her on and then kind of go over your mold, the surface of the mold. I don't know if you can see it, pretend I have resin in there, just about 6 to 8 inches, and that really helps to draw out the bubbles and pop them. And that's it. Sometimes we will do that a couple times during the curing process, so maybe about 15 minutes in and then about half an hour in. But if you've followed, I've found if I've warmed my bottles, if I've been careful about pouring and everything, that I really don't have a problem with that. So usually the bubbles rise to the top and you can pop them and then your pieces come out really nicely without any bubbles inside. So the sixth tip, and that is if you've finished your project and it's the next day, usually the resin takes about 24 hours to cure, sometimes even a bit longer, you know, and you find that there's bubbles inside the piece, then you can take a sharp razor and cut the surface of the resin to expose the hole and then pour in a tiny bit more of resin into a top coat. So I think that's a bit of an advanced technique. I haven't done that, but I could totally see where it would be valuable. Sometimes you get bubble pieces stuck inside the piece. There are a few bubbles in there and I actually like it. I think it gives interest to your piece, and if you're doing any kind of water themed ones or beach themed pieces, maybe a bubble or two inside is not a bad thing. The other thing though is if I had seen some of these, I may at the time have kind of gently taken a toothpick and try to help that particular bubble come out. But as I mentioned, I actually love it in there. I find every time I look at this, I discover something new. So I think those were the 6 tips for reducing bubbles in your resin. So I will quickly go through it again. 1 is to seal your surface if it's a porous surface before doing the resin pouring. 2 is to warm your bottles so that they're warm to the touch when you use them. 3 is to be gentle when you're mixing the resin to not introduce unnecessary air. 4, again, carefully pour the resin against the side of your mold when you're filling the mold to let the air give it a chance to escape. 5 is to use a butane torch, or if you don't have a torch, you can actually do that process with a simple straw and use your breath over the surface to help raise the bubbles out of the piece. You just want to be careful not to introduce moisture into your piece with this technique. And then finally, the 6th one is if your piece has cured and there's a big bubble inside or a bubble inside, you can use a razor to cut and make expose a little hole that the air can escape, and then fill that with resin. So I hope those were helpful. I really think once you do a couple of them, you'll see it's not as complicated as it seems. It does take a few steps, but I think something just where you're taking something simple, like I mentioned, the glitter, or even the dried pressed flowers, and putting them into a mold is probably one of the easiest beginner projects. So this one has some dried hydrangeas. We have this on Sustain My Craft Habit. It's simple and it's beautiful. I wear this piece all the time and I give it to friends for gifts and such. That's the other great thing about resin, is that not a lot of people take up the challenge to use it. So when you actually do and you make things, people are really impressed, and it is a special skill, but it's well worth it. Thank you all so much for joining me. Please do check us out on Instagram as well, though I really appreciate your time. And if you have any other topics that you'd like to see covered, just leave them in the comments below. Thank you, everybody. Bye.